Let me list some facts for you. Fact: 24 of the 30 epidemiological studies reviewed by EPA failed to support EPA's conclusion, in that 24 of those 30 studies did not report statistically significant increased risk of lung cancer. Fact: one of the largest and most recent studies on environmental tobacco smoke was recently published in the American Journal of Public Health, November 1992. That study was conducted with funding from the National Cancer Institute. It was not supported in any way by any tobacco company. The study specifically examined exposures of non-smokers at home, exposures at the workplace, and exposures during childhood. That NCI study reported no overall statistically significant association between ETS and lung cancer for any of those situations I mentioned. That National Cancer Institute study is not even included in the EPA risk assessment. If the data from that study were included in the EPA risk assessment, the overall lung cancer risk estimates from ETS exposure would not be statistically significant. Fact: of the 11 U.S. studies on which the EPA relative risk calculation was based, not one originally reported an overall statistically significant risk. It was only after the EPA changed the rules and went back and lowered the statistical standard used by the study's own authors that EPA was able to force the conclusion of increased risk. Fact: to put ETS in context, if one assembles the epidemiological studies assessing the risk of drinking chlorinated water and applies the meta-analysis principles the EPA used on the environmental tobacco smoke risk assessment, then one reaches the same conclusion as the authors of a recent study published in the American Journal of Public Health. Namely, drinking chlorinated water, the normal drinking water of the vast majority of the United States, produces twice as many cancer deaths than the lung cancer deaths EPA claims are associated with environmental tobacco smoke.
What do you say the health risk is of secondary smoke? How great is the risk?
As of today, the science does not support a claim that environmental tobacco smoke is a risk factor for lung cancer.
So there is no increased risk?
Statistically, if you look at all the available scientific information today, there is no risk of disease from exposure to environmental tobacco smoke.
What is the motivation, again, getting back to that question of the EPA doing this, then what is the motivation?
I think that the report Tom showed you is very indicative of how EPA conducts its activities. Let's remember who the EPA is. They brought us dioxin. They brought us Alar. They have brought together Administrator Riley, who you all will see at a press conference tomorrow, was so concerned about this that he gathered an expert panel. That expert panel was not kind to the EPA. They said that their science is used unevenly. Certainly, I think that a case has been made today that the science has been used unevenly on environmental tobacco smoke. They changed the rules and admitted it and said, well, maybe the rules need to be changed because this is where we want to go on this issue.
Channel 4 News at 4.
The word from the Environmental Protection Agency is what many non-smokers have claimed for years.
With this study, the EPA now says that secondhand smoke is as dangerous as asbestos, arsenic, and radon. As expected, the tobacco industry is firing back with its own studies that say chlorinated drinking water causes more cancer deaths than passive smoke.
Today, tobacco representatives claimed the EPA's conclusions are politically motivated and just plain wrong.
If you look at all the available scientific information today, there is no risk of disease from exposure to environmental tobacco smoke.
Alexandra Schultz would rather compromise and light up in designated areas.
But I wouldn't like it to hear that it's banned because I'd like to have the freedom to smoke when I'd like to.
And then there are others who say the EPA study is just too inconclusive to start a war on smoking.
I don't think it's truly accurate. I've been around a lot of smokers, and truly, it doesn't bother me a great deal.
Linda Vester, News 4, Washington.
From Fox 5, this is the 10 o'clock news. A study that links secondhand cigarette smoke to lung cancer has the tobacco industry smoldering. The Environmental Protection Agency plans to release a report tomorrow that says thousands of non-smokers die every year from secondhand smoke. Tobacco backers say the report is flawed.
Tobacco giant Philip Morris says the EPA did not use the most up-to-date data and skewed the studies to make secondhand smoke seem more dangerous than it really is.
EPA did no clinical or laboratory research. In fact, EPA did not even conduct an epidemiological study on environmental tobacco smoke.
This is News Channel 2 at 5.
Tobacco growers and cigarette smokers are bracing for the worst now, not because of the oil announcement today, but rather a new report from the EPA. The study reveals that secondhand smoke causes cancer even in people who do not smoke. As one might expect, the nation's tobacco companies are disputing the EPA's findings. Philip Morris vice president says the data that he saw does not indicate that secondhand smoke causes cancer.
The risk assessment is based on such a fragile house of cards that if it dealt with anything other than tobacco, many of you would have already ripped it apart, and the EPA bureaucracy would have buried it in embarrassment.
Parrish added that using the very same evidence, the study could have concluded that chlorinated water also causes cancer.
WAND News at 6.
The tobacco industry is quickly responding to the EPA's report. The senior vice president of one of the largest cigarette manufacturing companies says scientific research does not support the EPA's claims.
They wanted to have a document that people could use to try to coerce people into not smoking, whether that be through litigation or urging unreasonable smoking restrictions. Those kind of claims have been made before. The science doesn't support them.
The tobacco industry is firing back at the report, saying it's not supported by existing scientific evidence. The tobacco industry is downplaying the results of the new EPA study. Our Mayor Lou Johannick talked via satellite with Steve Parrish, who's Senior Vice President of Philip Morris, a cigarette maker, for his reaction.
Well, what the EPA has done is tried to make scientific claims and say they have come to scientific conclusions without the scientific data to back that up. And what I am saying to people is you don't have to believe me. I understand sometimes people are skeptical of what tobacco company representatives have to say. Just look at the scientific data. It's pretty clear that of the 30 studies that the EPA looked at, 24 of those found no statistically significant increased risk of lung cancer from exposure to environmental tobacco smoke. That's 24 out of 30.
Mr. Parrish, do you think your product is at all hazardous to the public's health?
That's a serious issue, and what we need to do is look at the science. We should have studies done, and we should look at the results. They report no statistically significant increase in the risk of lung cancer from exposure to environmental tobacco smoke, and that's what the data shows.
This is Wave 3 First News with Jackie Hayes.
Joining us now from New York is Steve Parrish with the Philip Morris Company. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
You think this new EPA report is flawed. Why?
One of the largest published studies ever done, a United States study that was funded by the National Cancer Institute and was published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal in 1992, was not even included in the document that was released today. The data from that study was not even included in the EPA analysis. That study reported no statistically significant increase in the risk of lung cancer from exposure to environmental tobacco smoke, and that proved to be the case whether the exposure came in the home or in the workplace.